Good evening, everyone. So I decided to do my informed consent compare and contrast using an informed consent form from Reflection Therapy, which is based out of the state of Alabama under the leadership of a marriage and family therapist, Mr. Robert W. Montgomery. At the beginning of his informed consent form, he provides us with information, which is a description of his practice, provides us with his educational background, as well as his professional expertise, different licensures that he currently holds, and specific individuals that his practice is geared toward providing services and supports through counseling. Looking at the ACA Code of Ethics and comparing it to this informed consent form for professional counseling services, I do find it to be in compliance, as it does list the purpose and the goals, as well as techniques and procedures. Talks about the counselor's qualifications. One of the areas that the ACA Code of Ethics mentions that this informed consent does not is the continuation of services should something happen to the client and or the counselor. However, it talks about termination. So it's not so much as it's something drastic or so let's say a medical illness or situation occurs between the counselor or the client, but it more so talks about once you've achieved your goals, then it talks about how you and the counselor that you're working with will make a decision to terminate your treatment services and for you to progress forward. It does mention written obligations and contracts. It states that this is a contract between the client and the counselor, and it provides information for both the counselor as well as a document of protection for the counselor. When reviewing some of the additional information that is included in this informed consent, they are specific about if they're working with minors. They talk about visitation and custody. One that I found to be really interesting that is not listed specifically in the Code of Ethics talks about no secrets policy when dealing with couples and families. And so when you're working with both couples and families, they are very adamant about making sure that clients are clear that when you go in for family and or couples counseling, this consent serves as a whole for the entire party. Because everyone is up on technology, it does talk about texting, email, and phone communications and how those are communicated. However, counseling is not included in those forms of communication. Talks about bringing firearms into the location where the services are being provided. Talks about signing the informed consent form and what you're consenting to as far as treatment is concerned through the counseling services. Also talks about your financial responsibility, that you do agree to pay the fees and the payments that are listed and agreed upon in this contract. And it also talks about what the overall contract is and what you're agreeing to. Of course, it talks about confidentiality, making phone calls if for some reason you miss appointments. And it also, on the first page, which I found to be very helpful to clients, is it lists what your rights are as a client. So it's basically saying that, yes, this document does provide a contract between both the client and the counselor, but let me list first what your rights are as a client and what you can expect from your counselors within the Reflection Therapy. Comparing it to the Maryland Code of Ethics, which is 10.58.03.05, where it starts on the Maryland Board of Regulations as it pertains to counseling regulations and guidelines. 0.09 through 0.11 talks about sexual and physical activity. That is one area that I did not see mentioned here in the informed consent form, and it's basically highlighting the disciplines that are associated with individuals who are for some reason involved in those type of behaviors. So of course, counselors should not have any sexual or physical contact with clients, and it talks about if a client is a victim of those type of behaviors, then 0.10 and 0.11 talk about the sanctions and the consequences that are associated with those type of behaviors and how the process that you follow in order to get those. One interesting thing that I did find as I wrap up when clicking on different informed consent forms and just reading different information from different offices and different counselors who are providing services, I found that the informed consent form is a generalized documentation. And although it is specific to whether it is the counselor and or the practice providing the service, the overall generalization of the guidelines are pretty much the same across the board from state to state. Again, different states have different laws where some things may be inserted, but for the most, it's generally pretty much the same. And so I found that to be very interesting as a form of comparison.